Racist landlord evicts black man, then learns he's a celebrity philanthropist. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. Marcus had lived in the same apartment for 3 years. It wasn't the nicest place. Faded walls, outdated fixtures, and a hallway that always smelled faintly of mildew. But it was home. Or at least it had been. That all changed one afternoon when he came home to find his landlord, Richard Holloway, standing in front of his door, arms crossed, a smug expression plastered on his face. "We need to talk," Richard said, blocking Marcus's way as he tried to unlock his door. Marcus sighed, already exhausted from a long day. "What's this about?" Richard pulled a folded document from his pocket and waved it in Marcus's face. "Eviction notice." Marcus froze, his keys still in the lock. "Eviction? For what?" Richard sneered. "I don't have to explain myself to you. You have 30 days to clear out." Marcus knew this wasn't about missed rent. He always paid on time. It wasn't about noise complaints or property damage either. This was about one thing and one thing only. Marcus had seen the way Richard treated him compared to the other tenants. How the man barely acknowledged his greetings, how maintenance requests went ignored, how he always seemed to have an issue when Marcus had friends over, but never when his white neighbors did. "You can't just kick me out without cause," Marcus said, keeping his voice calm. Richard smirked. "I can, and I am. You people always think you can bend the rules." Marcus's jaw tightened. "You people?" Richard's smile widened, like he was enjoying himself. "You heard me." Marcus took a step back, inhaling deeply. He could argue, he could fight, but not here, not now. Instead, he turned and walked past Richard, pushing open his door. He wouldn't give the man the satisfaction of a reaction. But this wasn't over. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the eviction notice. He had options. He could contest it legally, but that could take months, maybe even years. And he had no interest in staying in a place where he wasn't wanted. Still, something about this felt too familiar, too unjust. This wasn't the first time he had been made to feel like an outsider in his own home. And he was tired of it. So he picked up his phone and made a call. "Hey, it's me," he said when the line connected. "I need a favor." The voice on the other end responded with enthusiasm. "You got it. What's going on?" Marcus exhaled. "I think it's time to shake things up." The next morning, Marcus didn't rush to start packing. Instead, he went about his usual routine. Because unlike Richard, he knew something the landlord didn't. He still had control over this situation. Richard must have expected him to leave quietly, maybe even to grovel or negotiate. But Marcus did neither. Instead, he made a few phone calls. He reached out to a lawyer, a journalist, and a real estate broker. By the time Richard saw him again, Marcus was standing outside the building, shaking hands with a man in a tailored suit. A camera crew was setting up nearby. Richard stormed over. "What the hell is going on?" Marcus turned to him with an easy smile. "Oh, didn't you hear? I'm not just moving out. I'm buying the entire property." Richard's face drained of color. "You're what?" Marcus chuckled, pulling out his phone. "You might want to check your email. My lawyer sent over an offer this morning." Richard's hands trembled as he pulled out his phone, tapping the screen furiously. His expression morphed from confusion to disbelief to outrage. "This can't be real," he muttered. "Oh, it's real." The camera crew zoomed in on Richard's stunned face. "You see, Richard," Marcus continued, his voice steady, "I don't just pay rent. I own buildings. I invest in communities. I make sure people like you don't get to treat others like trash just because you think you can." Richard's eyes darted around, realization sinking in that people were watching, filming, recording. His reputation, his business was now on full display. You can't just buy this place," Richard stammered. Marcus shrugged. "Turns out I can." The man in the tailored suit, Marcus's broker, cleared his throat. "The sale is already being finalized. You'll have to vacate your office by next month." Richard opened his mouth, then closed it again. Marcus let the silence stretch. Now he knew what it felt like to be powerless. After a long moment, Richard muttered, "This isn't over." Marcus smiled, stepping closer, voice just low enough for Richard to hear. "Oh, I think it is." Richard swallowed hard, and for the first time since they had met, he had nothing left to say. Richard stormed off, his face red with humiliation, but Marcus didn't let his guard down. Men like Richard didn't give up that easily. The cameras had captured everything. His racist comments, his stunned silence, his inability to fight back when faced with someone who had power. But Marcus knew that power didn't just come from money. It came from control, influence, and the ability to set the rules. And now, he had all three. By the end of the day, news of the property sale had already spread. It started as whispers among the tenants, but soon, it was being discussed in local newspapers, blogs, and social media. The headline was impossible to ignore. Black investor buys building after racist landlord evicts him. Poetic justice at its finest. Marcus hadn't wanted this attention, but if it helped expose men like Richard, he was fine with it. Later that evening, he received a call from his real estate broker. "We've officially closed the deal. The building is yours." Marcus exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. He wasn't just a tenant anymore, he was the landlord. "Perfect," he said. "Now, let's talk about the first order of business." His broker chuckled. "Let me guess. Richard?" Exactly. Marcus already had a plan. The same way Richard had served him with an unjust eviction notice, Marcus would return the favor, but legally. He wouldn't cut corners. He wouldn't resort to intimidation. He would do it the right way. The next morning, Marcus arrived at the building's management office with his lawyer. Richard was inside, shuffling through paperwork, looking stressed and disheveled. When he saw Marcus walk in, his expression darkened. "What the hell do you want?" Richard spat. Marcus smiled. "Just making sure everything is running smoothly." Richard scoffed. "You think you're some kind of hero? That people like you can just walk in and take what you want?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "People like me." Before he could respond, his lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman named Camille, placed a thick envelope on Richard's desk. "This is your official notice to vacate. Per the terms of the sale, you are required to surrender all property keys and vacate the premises within 30 days. Richard grabbed the envelope, flipping through the pages. His hands shook. You can't do this," he stammered. Camille smiled. "Actually, we can. And we are." Richard looked between them, searching for some loophole, some way out. But there was none. Marcus leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You spent years making tenants feel powerless. Richard, you thought you could get away with treating people however you wanted. But now the rules have changed." Richard clenched his fists. "You're making a mistake." "No," Marcus corrected, stepping back. "I'm making things right." As he and Camille turned to leave, Marcus glanced over his shoulder one last time. Richard was still standing there, gripping the eviction notice like a man who had just lost everything. And for the first time, Marcus felt no sympathy. With Richard gone, Marcus wasted no time turning the building into something better. The first thing he did was hold a meeting with the tenants. Many of them had lived in fear for years, scared of rent hikes, unfair treatment, and sudden evictions. Marcus wanted to change that. Standing before them in the building's small, dimly lit lobby, he cleared his throat. "My name is Marcus, and as of today, I'm the new owner of this building. That means things are about to change." A murmur spread through the crowd. Some were excited, others skeptical. An older woman in the front row raised her hand. "Does this mean our rent is going up?" Marcus shook his head. "No. In fact, for some of you, it'll be going down." Gasps rippled through the group. A younger man in the back crossed his arms. "What's the catch?" Marcus smiled. "No catch, just fairness." He explained his plan: new maintenance policies, a fair leasing system, security upgrades, and a tenant advisory board. By the time he was finished, the tension in the room had melted away. People clapped, some even wiping away tears. For the first time in years, they felt safe. But Marcus's work wasn't done yet, because while he had won the battle against Richard, the war against discrimination wasn't over. The media attention on his story had made him a symbol. People reached out, activists, lawyers, renters who had faced similar injustices. And that's when Marcus realized something. He couldn't stop at just one building, so he expanded. Within a year, he had purchased 3 more properties, each one previously owned by landlords with histories of discrimination. He turned them into safe, fair, and affordable spaces for people of all backgrounds. One evening, as he sat in his new office, looking out over the city, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "I hope you're happy. You ruined me." Marcus didn't need to ask who it was. Richard. He stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back a simple response. "No, Richard. You ruined yourself." He put his phone down, exhaling. For the first time in years, he finally felt at peace. Because he hadn't just won. He had changed the game. Over the next several months, Marcus's influence only grew. What had started as a single act of justice, buying the very building he was evicted from, had turned into a movement. He was no longer just a tenant or a landlord. He was a force for change. His story spread beyond local news, reaching national headlines, talk shows, and social media. People began calling him the Justice Landlord, a title that at first made him laugh. But over time, he embraced it. Because this wasn't just about real estate. It was about dignity. One afternoon, Marcus sat in his office, reviewing plans for his latest property acquisition. His assistant, Jordan, walked in holding up a tablet. "You're not going to believe this," Jordan said, placing the tablet on the desk. Marcus glanced down and saw a news article. The headline read, "Former slumlord Richard Holloway declares bankruptcy after losing all properties." Marcus blinked, rereading the words. Bankruptcy. He had known Richard was struggling after losing his building, but he hadn't expected him to completely collapse. Jordan crossed his arms. "Looks like karma finally caught up with him." Marcus exhaled slowly. Yeah, it did. He had never set out to destroy Richard. He had only wanted fairness. But in the end, Richard's own actions had led to his downfall. And yet, Marcus didn't feel triumphant. He just felt finished. Richard was no longer his problem. Marcus had bigger things to focus on. With his growing influence, Marcus began meeting with city officials, community leaders, and legal advocates. His goal? To push for laws that would protect renters from landlords like Richard. And he wasn't alone. Other investors, inspired by his story, reached out wanting to fund projects that prioritize people over profit. One evening, Marcus stood in front of a packed auditorium, speaking at a housing reform conference. He looked out at the faces watching him, some skeptical, some hopeful, all listening. "Change isn't easy," he said. "People like Richard Holloway have gotten away with discrimination for years because no one held them accountable. But we're done accepting that. We're done letting power go unchecked." He paused, scanning the room. "We are the ones who set the rules now." Thunderous applause filled the space. And in that moment, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. A few weeks later, Marcus visited his first building, the one that had started it all. The changes were impossible to ignore. The hallways had been repainted, security cameras installed, and the lobby redesigned to feel welcoming rather than oppressive. As he walked through the halls, he heard a voice behind him. "Mr. Bennett?" He turned to see an elderly woman, Ms. Johnson, one of the longest-tenured tenants. She smiled warmly. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done." Marcus returned her smile. "I appreciate that." "No, really," she insisted. "This place feels different now. Safer. Like a real home." Marcus nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. That was always the goal, to make sure no one else went through what he did. As he stepped outside, the city stretched before him, endless, alive, full of possibilities. He had won his battle, but there were still countless others who needed justice. And Marcus? He was just getting started. It had been a year since Marcus had turned the tables on Richard Holloway. What started as an act of justice had evolved into a full-scale transformation, not just of a single building, but of an entire movement. Marcus had become a symbol of change in the housing industry, someone who refused to allow discrimination and exploitation to go unchecked. He sat in his office, overlooking the skyline of a city he had once thought would never accept him. Now he owned multiple buildings, worked alongside legal advocates, and had even been invited to speak on panels about tenant rights and ethical property management. But despite all the success, he knew his work wasn't done. Jordan, his assistant, knocked on the door. "Got a visitor," he said, stepping aside to let in a woman with an air of authority. Marcus recognized her immediately. Angela Torres, a journalist who had been instrumental in exposing Richard's shady practices. Angela took a seat, pulling out her notepad. "Marcus, I have a proposition for you," she said, her eyes sharp with curiosity. He leaned forward. "I'm listening." She tapped her pen against the table. "What if we go bigger? What if we take this national?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You mean expand?" Angela nodded. "Not just with properties, with awareness. You've already changed lives here, but there are millions of renters facing the same discrimination you did. We need to make sure this message reaches them." Marcus considered it. He had spent the last year buying and rehabilitating buildings, ensuring fair rental practices, and fighting against predatory landlords. But he had never considered taking it beyond his city. Until now. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Angela smiled. "A nationwide initiative. A platform that highlights cases of discrimination, holds landlords accountable, and pushes for housing reform at a legislative level. We'd need funding, media coverage, legal experts. But with your name attached to it, we could make real change." Marcus sat back, letting the idea sink in. It was ambitious. It was overwhelming. But it was exactly what needed to happen. He extended his hand across the desk. "Let's do it." Angela shook his hand, sealing the deal. The next phase of his fight for justice had begun. Over the next 6 months, the Justice Housing Initiative was born. It started with a website that allowed tenants to report unfair treatment anonymously. Then, lawyers and activists got involved, offering free consultations and legal aid to renters in need. Soon, the project expanded into a full-scale campaign for federal housing reform, with Marcus as its leading advocate. His influence reached the highest levels of government. He met with senators, attended city hall meetings, and even appeared on national television. "What you're doing is incredible," one talk show host said during an interview. "But do you ever worry about retaliation?" Marcus smiled knowingly. The people who thrive on exploiting others are always going to be afraid of accountability. If they want to retaliate, that only proves we're doing something right. His words went viral. Suddenly, people across the country were sharing their own experiences, tagging #JusticeHousing in their posts, demanding better tenant protections and ethical real estate practices. The movement was no longer just Marcus's fight. It belonged to everyone. One afternoon, Marcus received an unexpected call. "I need to see you," the voice on the other end said. It was Richard Holloway. Marcus was taken aback. He hadn't heard from Richard since the day he was forced out of the building. Curious, Marcus agreed to meet. They sat across from each other in a small cafe, two men who had once stood on opposite sides of power. Richard looked different. He was no longer the arrogant landlord who had sneered at Marcus on eviction day. He looked defeated, smaller. "I lost everything," Richard admitted. "Not just my buildings, my reputation, my credibility. No one will rent from me, let alone work with me." Marcus sipped his coffee. "Actions have consequences." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "You think I don't know that?" He looked down. "That's why I called you." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Richard hesitated. "Because I want to make things right. I was wrong. I see that now." Marcus wasn't sure if he believed him. Richard leaned forward. "I want to help. I have years of experience in real estate. I know the flaws in the system. I can help you fix them." Marcus studied him. Was this genuine remorse or just a desperate attempt to regain relevance? "I don't need help from you," Marcus finally said. "What I need is for people like you to stop standing in the way of progress." Richard exhaled, looking like a man who had finally run out of options. But Marcus wasn't cruel. After a moment, he slid a card across the table. "That's the number of a nonprofit that helps rehabilitate landlords who want to change their practices," Marcus said. "If you're serious about making things right, start there." Richard stared at the card, then at Marcus. "Why are you giving me this?" he asked. Marcus stood up, grabbing his coat. "Because I don't just believe in tearing things down," he said. "I believe in building something better." And with that, he walked away. In the months following Richard's plea for redemption, Marcus focused entirely on expanding the Justice Housing Initiative. The project had taken on a life of its own, with thousands of people across the country sharing their experiences, demanding change, and calling for new policies to protect tenants from discrimination and exploitation. With every speech he gave, every interview he did, and every building he acquired, Marcus saw the movement growing stronger. One evening, he sat in his office, staring at the wall of photos and articles documenting his journey. There were pictures of his first building, the one Richard had tried to evict him from. There were news clippings from the day he finalized his first major real estate deal. There were letters from tenants who had written to thank him for changing their lives. It was surreal. He had started as a man fighting for his own dignity. Now he was leading a revolution. His phone buzzed. Jordan's name flashed on the screen. "Marcus," Jordan said, his voice tinged with excitement. "You need to turn on the news. Right now." Marcus grabbed the remote and switched on the television. A news anchor was speaking, and the banner at the bottom of the screen made Marcus sit up straight. "Breaking. Congress to introduce landmark tenant protection bill following national movement." The camera cut to a press conference, where a senator was standing behind a podium. "For too long, landlords have had unchecked power over tenants," the senator said. "It's time we establish federal laws that protect renters from unjust evictions, rent gouging, and housing discrimination." Thanks to activists, legal experts, and the incredible work of the Justice Housing Initiative, we are introducing a bill that will ensure fairness in housing. Marcus froze. He knew his movement had been gaining momentum, but this was beyond anything he had expected. Jordan's voice came through the phone. "Marcus, do you realize what this means?" Marcus could barely breathe. He had fought back against one landlord. Now he was changing the entire system. The following week, Marcus was invited to Washington, D.C. to meet with the very lawmakers pushing for the bill. As he walked into the Capitol, he couldn't help but think about where he had been just a couple of years ago. Evicted, underestimated, dismissed. Now he was here as an advisor, an advocate, a leader. He shook hands with senators, sat in on policy discussions, and helped draft sections of the new legislation. Every decision was rooted in his own experiences, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what he had. At one point, a congresswoman turned to him and said, "Mr. Bennett, I don't think you realize how much impact you've had. Your story alone has pushed this movement forward." Marcus gave a small smile. "I didn't do it alone. The people did, and he meant it. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel powerless." A month later, the bill was officially signed into law. For the first time in history, there were nationwide protections against discriminatory evictions and unfair rental practices. Marcus stood on the steps of the Capitol, looking out at the reporters, the activists, the families who had gathered to witness the moment. When he stepped up to the podium, cameras flashed, microphones pointed at him. He took a deep breath. "This is more than a law," he said, his voice steady. "This is a message to every tenant, every renter, every person who has ever been told they don't belong. You have a right to be here, and no one can take that from you." Thunderous applause erupted, and in that moment, Marcus knew he had done something that would outlive him. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, a home he owned, free of fear, free of injustice, he thought about Richard Holloway. He wondered what the man was doing now, if he had changed, if he had learned anything. But then Marcus realized it didn't matter. Richard was the past. Marcus was the future, and the future had never looked brighter. Marcus sat on the balcony of his latest property, a historic apartment complex in the heart of the city that he had recently purchased and renovated. The skyline stretched before him, filled with buildings that once seemed unreachable. Now, he was no longer just a tenant fighting for fairness. He was a leader shaping the industry. His phone buzzed. It was Jordan. "You're going to love this," Jordan said, barely containing his excitement. "The mayor's office just called. They want to partner with the Justice Housing Initiative." Marcus exhaled, a slow smile forming. "A partnership? What kind?" "They want you to oversee a citywide housing reform project, implementing your policies into existing housing regulations, working with city officials to make fair housing a reality." Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of the moment settle in. This was it. This was what he had worked for, not just fighting back against injustice, but building a system that prevented it from happening in the first place. "I'm in," he said. Over the next few months, Marcus worked tirelessly with the city to implement real change. Rent control measures, eviction protections, affordable housing expansions. All things that had once seemed impossible were now being written into law. And then came the most unexpected moment of all. One afternoon, Marcus was walking through one of his properties when he saw a familiar face. Richard Holloway, the former landlord, once arrogant and untouchable, now looked older, smaller, humbled. Richard approached, hesitating before speaking. "I heard about what you're doing," he said. "You're actually changing things." Marcus studied him, unsure of his intentions. Richard sighed. "I fought so hard to hold on to my old ways, and look where it got me. I lost everything. But you took that loss and turned it into something bigger." There was a long silence between them. "Why are you here, Richard?" Marcus finally asked. Richard hesitated before speaking. "Because I want to help." For real this time, Marcus didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if Richard truly meant it, or if this was just another attempt at regaining relevance. But then he thought about his own journey, how people had doubted him, how he had to prove himself over and over again. So he made a decision. "I'm not interested in redemption stories," Marcus said. "But if you want to use what you know to fix what you broke, then there's a place for you in this movement." Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. "I do." Marcus extended a hand. "A test. A challenge." Richard shook it. Maybe people could change. Maybe justice wasn't just about winning, it was about transformation. A year later, Marcus stood in front of a packed stadium at a national housing summit. His name was now synonymous with housing reform. His initiative had expanded to multiple cities, and former landlords, including Richard, had joined forces to change the system from within. When he stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. "We built this movement out of necessity," he said. "We fought against injustice, against greed, against a system designed to keep us powerless. But now we build something better." The audience erupted in applause. Marcus looked out at the crowd and saw not just hope, but certainty. Because this wasn't just about fighting back anymore. This was about creating a future where fairness was the rule, not the exception. And Marcus? He was just getting started. A few months after the National Housing Summit, Marcus found himself in an entirely new position. One he never imagined when he first set out to fight against Richard Holloway. He wasn't just a property owner or an advocate anymore. He was a policy leader, an industry disruptor, and a national figure in the fight for fair housing. His inbox was flooded daily with emails from city officials, investors, and community organizers who wanted to bring his vision to their own towns. His calendar was packed with speaking engagements, legal meetings, and media interviews. He had even received a call from a presidential candidate's team asking him to consult on their housing policy agenda. It was overwhelming, but Marcus never lost sight of the reason he started. This was never about power or prestige. It was about people. And nothing reminded him of that more than the letters he received from renters across the country. One in particular stood out. It was from a single mother in Chicago who had been on the verge of eviction due to an unfair lease agreement. Because of Marcus's advocacy, a new tenant protection law had passed in her state, and she was able to fight back against her landlord's illegal practices. She wrote, "Because of your work, my kids and I still have a home. I don't know how to thank you." Marcus held the letter for a long time. This was why he kept going. One evening, Marcus was sitting in his office when Jordan walked in, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You ever think about taking this global?" Jordan asked, leaning against the doorframe. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Global?" Jordan nodded. "Fair housing issues aren't just an American problem. There are renters in Europe, Africa, Asia, all over the world, who are facing the same discrimination you fought against. What if the Justice Housing Initiative went international?" Marcus sat back, considering the idea. He had spent the last few years building a national movement. Could he really take it further? The thought was daunting, but then Marcus had never been one to shy away from a challenge. He smiled. "Let's do it." The expansion of the Justice Housing Initiative became one of the most ambitious fair housing projects in history. Marcus and his team partnered with human rights organizations, international legal teams, and economic development agencies to bring tenant protections to countries where renters had little to no rights. It wasn't easy. Every country had its own legal system, its own challenges, and its own version of landlords like Richard Holloway, people who profited off of unfair housing practices. But Marcus knew how to fight them, and soon the Justice Housing Initiative became more than just an advocacy group. It became a global movement. One day, Marcus was invited to the United Nations to speak about housing as a human right. Standing at the podium, looking out at world leaders, activists, and journalists, he took a deep breath. "Fair housing isn't just about contracts and policies," he said. "It's about dignity. It's about security. It's about making sure that no matter where you live, you have the right to a safe and stable home." He paused, scanning the audience. "This isn't just an American issue. This is a global issue. And today we commit to changing that." Together, the applause was deafening. Marcus had started as one man fighting against an unjust landlord. Now he was leading a worldwide revolution. And this was only the beginning. This was only the beginning. A year had passed since Marcus took the Justice Housing Initiative global, and the results were staggering. What had started as a personal battle against an unfair eviction had now shifted global policies, sparked housing reforms, and created alliances between governments, legal experts, and activists. Everywhere he went, people knew his name. In some cities, new fair housing laws were even nicknamed after him. But with success came new challenges. Corporations and real estate moguls who had benefited from unethical housing practices saw Marcus as a threat. Lawsuits were filed against his initiative, smear campaigns were launched, and lobbying groups tried to undermine his influence. Marcus had expected resistance, but he hadn't anticipated how ruthless the opposition would be. One evening, Jordan rushed into Marcus's office, his face pale. "You need to see this." He placed a stack of documents on Marcus's desk. Marcus flipped through them, his stomach tightening. It was a detailed campaign, funded by wealthy real estate tycoons to discredit him. Fake scandals, false accusations, manipulated reports. "They're trying to destroy your reputation," Jordan said. "They think if they take you down, the movement dies." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Then they still don't get it." Jordan frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus looked up. "This movement isn't about me. They can attack my name, my past, whatever they want. But the people, they won't stop fighting." And he was right. The attacks on Marcus only made the movement stronger. Supporters rallied behind him. Journalists exposed the corporate smear tactics, and millions of renters across the world refused to be silenced. Marcus received messages from people who had once been afraid to speak out, but not anymore. One letter stood out. It was from a former landlord, someone who had once exploited renters but had changed his ways after seeing what Marcus had built. "You made me see the truth. I was part of the problem. Now I want to be part of the solution." Marcus folded the letter and smiled. The opposition was losing, not because Marcus fought harder, but because justice was no longer just his fight. It belonged to everyone. A few months later, a major news outlet published an in-depth exposé revealing the full extent of the corporate attacks against Marcus and the Justice Housing Initiative. It was a turning point. The corporations that had tried to destroy him were now under investigation for corruption and illegal eviction practices. Several executives were arrested. Major real estate companies were forced to pay restitution to tenants they had wrongfully evicted. And Marcus? He had won. Not just the battle, but the war. As Marcus stood on stage at an international housing conference, looking out at thousands of people who had come together to fight for fair housing, he knew this was bigger than he ever imagined. He took a deep breath, the weight of his journey settling over him. "We built something unstoppable," he said, "because this isn't about one person, one law, or one country. This is about humanity, about dignity, about the right to have a place to call home." The audience erupted in applause, and as Marcus stepped back, watching the sea of faces standing in solidarity, he knew this was only the beginning of something even greater. Marcus had thought he had seen everything: evictions, discrimination, legal battles, and even international pushback. But nothing could have prepared him for what came next. One evening, as he wrapped up a meeting with his team, Jordan entered his office with an expression that immediately put Marcus on edge. "We have a problem," Jordan said, placing a laptop on the desk and opening a news article. Marcus leaned in, scanning the headline. "Billionaire landlords form alliance to challenge housing reform, vow to reverse tenant protections." His stomach sank. The fight wasn't over. The opposition was regrouping. This wasn't just one landlord like Richard Holloway. This was an organized, well-funded coalition of powerful corporate landlords, real estate moguls, and lobbying groups. They were filing lawsuits against every major fair housing law that Marcus had fought to establish. They were pouring millions into political campaigns, trying to roll back protections. If they succeeded, millions of tenants would be at risk again. Jordan exhaled. "They're playing the long game, Marcus. If they can't take you down directly, they'll go after the laws you helped create." Marcus sat back, thinking. He had spent years pushing the system forward. Now they were trying to drag it back, but he wasn't going to let them. He picked up his phone. "Get me a meeting with our legal team," he said. "If they want a war, they're going to get one." What followed was the most intense battle Marcus had ever fought. He and his team mobilized activists, lawyers, and politicians. They exposed the billionaires funding the anti-tenant movement, making sure the public knew exactly who was behind the attack on their rights. Social media campaigns erupted. Protests were organized in front of corporate offices. Former tenants of these landlords shared their horror stories. The momentum was overwhelming. One by one, politicians who had taken money from the real estate moguls were forced to backtrack. Lawsuits filed against housing protections were dismissed by the courts. The billionaires were losing, and in their desperation, they made their biggest mistake yet. They tried to bribe Marcus. One afternoon, Marcus received a private invitation to a meeting at an upscale penthouse overlooking the city. He knew exactly what this was about. When he arrived, 3 men in tailored suits sat across from him. They were CEOs of some of the largest property management firms in the country. "Marcus," one of them said, offering a polite smile, "we admire your work, truly. But let's be honest. Fighting us is exhausting, isn't it?" Marcus said nothing. Another executive leaned forward. "We're prepared to offer you a deal, a position with us, leading our new tenant relations initiative. You'd have the power to shape policy from the inside." Marcus smirked. "And what would I have to give up?" The third man exhaled. "Step back from advocacy. Stop pushing for new regulations. In return, you'd have more influence, a substantial salary, and—" Marcus cut him off. "You want me to sell out?" The room fell silent. Marcus shook his head. "You don't get it. I'm not fighting for a paycheck. I'm fighting for people. And I'd rather burn everything down than let you win." He stood up. The men exchanged glances. One of them sighed. "You really want to make enemies of people like us?" Marcus smiled. "You were never my friends." And with that, he walked out. The bribery attempt backfired spectacularly. Marcus publicly exposed the meeting, revealing that the most powerful landlords in the country had tried to buy his silence. The news exploded. Their credibility crumbled overnight. More lawsuits were thrown out. Housing protections became stronger than ever. The billionaires had made one fatal mistake. They underestimated Marcus. Months later, Marcus stood at the grand opening of a new affordable housing development, one funded by his initiative, built by ethical investors, and protected under the very laws he had fought to uphold. As he cut the ribbon, surrounded by families who would now have safe, stable homes, he knew he had won, not just for himself, for everyone